So I'm going to introduce Gerard and Salwa. Some of you most of you will have met them, but I think for the sake of everybody who's not been, we should do a proper introduction. So first of all, Gerard is an Australian and British lawyer who's dedicated a large chunk of his life to the defense of Palestinian teenagers caught up in the Israeli judicial system. He and Salwa set up Military Court Watch 8 years ago, and they have been awakening the conscience of the world to the scandal of what happens basically to 12 to 17-year-old Palestinian boys, especially in the 24 hours after they are arrested in the middle of the night. His work has resulted in debates in the House of Commons, in an inquiry by top UK lawyers funded by the Foreign Office, and he and Salwa have been on tours of the UK and the US and Australia to spread awareness of what is going on. These night raids on Palestinian villages affect not only the teenage boys who are arrested, but also their parents and their siblings and the villages where they live. Salwa will talk, I hope, about the effect of these arrests on the families and the villages. Salwa is from Nazareth, the daughter of a Palestinian Anglican vicar, who has spent her whole life defending Palestinian women, for a long time through the Women's Legal Aid and Counselling Centre, and since 2013 with Military Court Watch. Even before that, Salwa had done one remarkable achievement to her credit. During the first Intifada, she set up a lingerie factory in Ramallah to create jobs for Palestinian women, and they exported Palestinian lingerie to top-end fashion shops in New York and London, including Harrods and John Lewis. And on their labels, it said, made in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And that was the start of a long battle to get Western countries to label Palestinian goods correctly. Eventually, in 2015, the European Union legislated that goods must be labeled in a way that distinguishes between Palestinian produce and the produce of Israeli settlements. On our West Bank tours, we've always visited Gerald and Salwa, and it's been one of the briefings that maybe people have remarked on most after the visit as something that horrified them. And of course, there are plenty of other horrors. So I'm going to start by asking Gerard to tell us what inspired him to give up what was no doubt a promising career at the Sydney Bar to this cause. So Gerard, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for organizing this, and hello to everyone. Many of us, to begin with, it was just an interest in the legal aspects, I think. What intrigued me was how could what is a pretty strong legal case go so horribly wrong on the ground. So that was the initial interest, the legal aspects and the disparity between what the legal position is and what's happening here.
And was it just you to start with, or did you gather a group of lawyers?
No, I came and initially came for 3 months and did some voluntary work on prisoners' issues, and yeah, sort of taken from there. It was just you know, I think anyone who's been to Offa Military Court or spent any time here, you know, just you see the massive gulf between, you know, what is a fairly clear legal situation and what the position actually is on the ground. And then I suppose the interest was, as a lawyer, you know, is there anything a lawyer can do to try and, you know, in some way close that gap?
And since we mentioned the Offa Military Court, and only a few of the people listening have been there, can you give us a very quick description of what it's like?
Well, I think the interesting thing is they've been there for 53 years, just how ramshackle they are. You know, they're basically fairly simple shacks. There are currently 2 military courts in the West Bank, one near Jerusalem and one near Jenin. It consists, the one near Jerusalem consists of, I think, 7 shacks. You have to go through security. 2 Palestinian family members can come and watch proceedings, but even though what they watch might just last a couple of minutes, it's a full day event for them. They'll have to get up early, go through multiple checkpoints, travel across the West Bank, go through a number of searches in the court, and then just waiting around. No one will tell them what time of day their case is actually on, so they'll just end up waiting there all day until in some cases, until their case is called. I think one thing that strikes most people who have been there is just how chaotic the court is. It's quite noisy. Another aspect of it is there's a clear demarcation in the courtroom. The Palestinians who are there know they're not going to get, they're not expecting a fair trial, so they don't really engage very much with the system. For them, it's more a family visit. So they'll be conducting conversations with their family members, trying to find out what's happening in the village, etc. And the Israeli court staff, they don't engage particularly most of the time with the Palestinians. They're sort of doing all the paperwork, etc. And lawyers are coming in and out, and it's just a generally quite chaotic scene. Very few evidentiary hearings in the court. Overwhelming majority of cases end in a plea bargain, so you don't get to hear any evidence in most cases. It's quite an effective revenue raising system. So the last data I saw, the military courts are raising about $6 million a year in fines. Most of the people who go through the military courts live in Area C, as you probably all know. People who live in Area C tend to be fairly poor, so that's a fair amount of money. Finally, I guess I'll just mention one perhaps surprising aspect of the military courts is 25% of the cases are traffic offenses. So that's Palestinians driving in Area C, maybe not wearing a seatbelt or speeding, can be pulled over by an Israeli policeman, and their case will end up in the military courts. The courts, last time I heard, were raising $25,000 a week on traffic offenses. Now, I think most people would be surprised that when you do establish military courts, which are permitted under the 4th Geneva Convention on a temporary basis, you don't expect an occupying power to be handing out traffic offenses and fines in the military court. But that's what's happened after 53 years.
What really shocked me when I went to witness one of these hearings was the sheer casualness of the whole operation. People talking the whole time. The judge was talking to the other judges, and there was constant conversations going on. Nothing of the atmosphere of an English court, as far as I've ever experienced that. Because of the language thing as well, I think that clearly the defendants didn't have any idea what most of the things that were happening, and occasionally the prosecutor would translate for them. But it must have been a horrendous experience for them.
To some extent, although by the time they get to court, they've sort of disengaged from that system. They know what the outcome will be. So like I said, they're not really listening very much, partly because, as you say, there's very limited translation. Sometimes you will hear a couple of minutes of Hebrew, and then if there is translation, it might take sort of 10, 15 seconds, clearly not a full translation. Salwa always picks up when she's there how inaccurate in many cases the translation is. And as you say, it's very casual. We've been there where the judge is asleep. It's worth bearing in mind that some of the judges live in the settlements. So, if you're an accused person in the military courts and you're charged with throwing stones at a settler or a settler vehicle, and the judge is a settler, that's probably only going to go one way. The lawyers who are there, mostly Palestinian lawyers, they work there 5 days a week, some of them for 15, 20 years. They've built up quite a close relationship with the Israeli military officers in the court, which, is not particularly surprising if you spend, 15 years in a shack with someone. But, I've seen a lawyer come in, a Palestinian lawyer come in and greet the Israeli guard by smacking him on the head with the statement of claim. You know, it's all just jokes. And yeah, like I say, it's quite an extraordinary experience how casual it is, how noisy it is, but it's very, like I said, everyone knows what the result is. So no one's there expecting that what they say or do will make any difference.
Very few people have actually experienced a night raid, but this is where most of the Palestinians are arrested. So I wondered if you could, well, you and Salwa could walk us through a typical night raid in a village near a settlement, and you know, what happens once they're arrested.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just put it into a little bit of context, which I think is helpful. One of the main things we do as an organization is we collect a lot of evidence. So each year we collect over 100 testimonies from children who are detained, and we analyze it for all sorts of issues. But one thing that really stands out is, where are these children getting arrested, the location of arrest. About 98% of these children who are arrested live within, on average, about 1 kilometer or so from a settlement or a road used by settlers. And that's really the key to it, that you know, that's not coincidental. To understand why it's not coincidental, you really have to, for a moment, look at the situation from an Israeli commander's perspective. The mission he's been given in the West Bank is essentially to guarantee the protection of the 450,000 Israeli civilians living in the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem. Now, those 450,000 Israeli civilians in the West Bank are living among about 3 million Palestinians. If you think about that, that's a fairly challenging military mission to be given to anyone, to guarantee the protection of 450,000 civilians essentially wandering around a conflict zone. And yet that's, whether he likes it or not, that's the mission of the military commander. Question is, how successful is he in that mission? There are any number of ways you can measure that, but if you were to measure it by how many settlers actually get killed in the West Bank, those commanders have been phenomenally successful. In 2012, according to the US State Department, not a single settler was killed in the West Bank. I should point out 2012 was an extraordinary year, but the 12-year average fatality rate for settlers in the West Bank is 4.9 settlers killed each year for the last 12 years. Not to trivialize those deaths, more people get killed in road traffic accidents. Now, to understand that, how that process works, it's useful, I think, sometimes to just take a very typical case. A fairly common case we will deal with is stone throwing. Plenty of people throw stones in the West Bank, Israelis and Palestinians. A not uncommon situation is we'll get a case where the accusation is that the accused person threw stones at a road used by settlers. Now, the dilemma for the military commander when that happens is that when Palestinians do start throwing stones at settler vehicles in the West Bank, it's quite hard to catch them, in that if there aren't any soldiers around and someone reports the incident and then soldiers turn up 10, 20 minutes later, chances are there won't be anyone there to catch. So that poses a real dilemma for these commanders. They have an active resistance. They know it's Palestinians, but they can't positively identify who. Now, if they were to do nothing and just say, well, you know, maybe we'll have better luck tomorrow catching someone, the danger from an Israeli perspective of that is, if you do nothing, you're likely to get more resistance. People will appreciate you can resist, and there's a chance of getting away with that active resistance. The end result of that will be you probably won't remain in occupied territory for very long. So it's not an option. So what these commanders generally do, it's got nothing to do with the law, but from a military perspective, I think it's pretty reasonable. They make two assumptions. They assume that the stone throwers were males, Palestinian males, aged between about 10 and 30, which will generally be the case. And they came from the nearest Palestinian village. And that too will almost certainly be the case. What they then do with that information is they pass that along to the local Israeli intelligence officer. So for the last 53 years, every Palestinian community in the West Bank has had a designated intelligence officer. And what that intelligence officer does is then he will, I should just point out, I guess if you're going to control territory, that's not particularly surprising, to divide the territory up like that into intelligence jurisdictions. What is slightly different perhaps in this situation is because this has gone on for 53 years, huge amounts of intelligence have been built up on all of these Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Things like how many Palestinians live in the village, what are their political affiliations, have they been arrested before, who's been arrested before for throwing stones, they can be rounded up again. But the most important thing, the most important information that intelligence officer has access to is who are the Palestinian collaborators in the village. What we can tell you after collecting a lot of evidence, regularly going to these communities, is that the level of infiltration in the West Bank is massive. The types of, whenever we go to a refugee camp or a village near a settlement, sooner or later, the villagers will raise the question of collaboration because it is such a big issue. And the kinds of ranges they give us for how extensive this is, we can't verify it. But what the villagers tell us is they believe anywhere from about 20% to 60% of the people in the village are collaborators. Whether that's accurate or not, it's difficult to say. It's clear that it is extensive. But the effect of that on the village is profound. The village knows, everyone in the village knows the village has been infiltrated, which means then it essentially unravels the social fabric. No one knows who to trust. And I think in the 14 years I've been here, the infiltration of these communities with collaborators is the best evidence I've seen to explain why you see very little coherent resistance in the West Bank, whether it's political, military, or peaceful, because it's so difficult to organize. The way people are recruited are numerous, but the common tactics are in the interrogation room. People are put under a lot of pressure. They can be offered things, early release, threatened, family members will be arrested. A popular way of recruiting people is through the permit system, particularly the work permit system. So if you want, it's obviously financially beneficial for a Palestinian in the West Bank to get a work permit to work inside Israel or a settlement, but they have to go through a security check. It's through that process frequently that they can be recruited. They can get a permit, but something will have to be given in return. So essentially what the intelligence officer does is he makes contact with any collaborators in the village, puts together a list of names, that's handed back to the military commander, and then he makes the arrests. At the moment, about 50% of the children, it fluctuates, but about half of the children are currently being arrested at night. And there are a number of practical reasons why that happens. One is very practical. Show up at 2 o'clock in the morning, the person's likely to be home. Second one is that if you send units of the Israeli army into a refugee camp during the day, almost certainly young men will come out and chuck rocks at them, so you'll have a riot. Sometimes the military wants to create a riot, but if they don't, then they'll go in at 2 o'clock in the morning. The final reason, and Salwa will talk more about this, is the most important, and that is if you send heavily armed soldiers into a civilian center of population at 2 in the morning, unsurprisingly, it has a tendency to terrify people. And the use of night raids, whether anyone is arrested or not, is probably the #1 tool used by the military in the West Bank to intimidate communities next door to settlements into not resisting in any way, shape, or form. Maybe I'll hand over to Salwa now, and she can say a little bit about, what some of these night raids look like.
Absolutely, Salwa. If you could explain what it's like to be at the receiving end of a night raid. I don't know if you've ever actually been there when it happens, but you must have spoken to lots of families who have been through that traumatic experience.
Yes, thank you. I mean, as you can imagine, night raids are terrifying experiences, not only for children, but for grown-ups as well. So typically, a large number of military vehicles will surround the house in question. And large numbers of soldiers will step out and surround it from all directions. And sometimes they don't have the exact address of the intended person to be arrested. So they make loud noises and they bang at different houses and they wake up the neighbors and they wake up the uncle and the grandparents until they finally get to the house that they intended to raid. As I said, these are terrifying experiences. The soldiers hardly ever knock at the door. Typically, they might either conduct a controlled explosion and blow the door open. Sometimes they use a device that works with pressure and they open a locked door with this device. People describe it to me that there's a kind of whoosh sound and then some sort of a noise, and then the door is open. Sometimes families tell me they wake up and find soldiers already inside the house, inside the bedroom. Sometimes they will use metal tools to bend the lock and open it. Typically, about 10 to 15 soldiers will walk into the house. They will separate the women and the young children, lock them up in a room, don't allow them to move around or, bring a glass of water to a child or bring a blanket to wrap somebody. The young men will be separated in a separate room. Sometimes the person in question will be taken into his bedroom and the interrogation will start without informing him of his rights. And on some occasions, the soldiers will search the house. They don't usually tell the family what they're looking for. Sometimes they look through wardrobes, for a certain T-shirt, a certain pair of shoes. Sometimes more serious things, they will be looking for weapons, pipe bombs, Molotov cocktails, stuff like that. And during the search, they will cause deliberate damage to the furniture, the simple furniture that these people have, tear curtains, mattresses, throw everything on the floor, break things in the kitchen, break doors of wardrobes and so on. Usually the soldiers don't stay long in the house because they're nervous and they're scared. They've been told, it's a dangerous village and the commander wants to get out as quickly as possible. I mean, I would say between 15, 20 minutes to an hour and a half. And then the person in question will be taken away in the middle of the night. Usually that if it's a child, the child will be tied painfully, sometimes to the front, sometimes to the back. The person will also be blindfolded and will be taken into the back of a military jeep. Very few cases is the family given a written document telling them where the child is being taken, for how long, what are his or her legal rights. And in the cases that they are given documents, there's a standard form which is written in both Arabic and Hebrew, but the relevant information is scribbled in Hebrew, handwritten in Hebrew by the commander. Parents tell me they don't understand it, but they're kind of forced to sign it. Sometimes the commander will take a picture of this document, which is meaningless to the parent, with the parent holding it to, to tick a box back in his office. As I said, the child will be taken away in the middle of the night. And as Martin already mentioned, the first 24 hours of arrest are crucial in terms of what will happen to that child. Most of them will end up pleading guilty. And the trauma that is left behind from that one night raid is devastating, not only for the child himself, but for the parents, for the children, the younger siblings. Mothers tell me how they don't sleep at night for fear that their house might be raided. Their sleep is very shallow because they're hyper vigilant. Every sound wakes them up. Because in their mind, they want, their main concern is they want to wake up their children before there's a bang at the front door. Younger children are traumatized. The young ones start to wet their beds again. Their school performance is affected. They don't want to sleep in their own bedrooms or their own beds. They cling to their parents. Any sound, any noise outside the house scares them. I was once visiting a family, and a boy, maybe 5 years old, came running to his mother, and he hugged her, and he was crying hysterically. And it turned out that he saw from very far across the hill, maybe, I don't know, 500 meters away, 2 military jeeps heading towards the village. And he knew in his mind exactly what that would mean. And he was terrified. He came running to the house. Luckily, on that occasion, the soldiers did not make it into the village. But if you're the military commander, that's exactly what you want. You want to frighten and terrify the entire village from as young as 5 years old, so that they don't even think about protesting or objecting or creating any problems for that commander in charge of that area. I don't know, Martin, if you want me to go on and talk about the effect of these night raids and the rest on children, or should I wait maybe a bit later?
Well, if I could just come back to Gerard to just describe what happens in the court, or I mean, in the immediate after they've been arrested, just to take us up to the morning after, and then there are lots of questions coming up, but I just wanted to complete that picture.
Sure. So just taking it from where the child is blindfolded and hand-tied, should just add that with the blindfolds, I mean, there's no security reason why children are blindfolded. If the concern is, eventually that child will be sent to one of the interrogation centers inside one of the settlements in the West Bank generally. If the concern was the child might see what's going on inside the settlement, if you want to know what's going on inside a settlement, you only have to ask a Palestinian who works there. So there's no security issue. In the issue of blindfolds went to the Supreme Court in Israel last year. And interestingly, the Supreme Court, the lawyers for the military said that, people shouldn't be blindfolded, except in very rare cases, and they'll make sure that it doesn't happen, as regularly as it has been. Since then, we're finding that still well over 90% of the children are being blindfolded, even though the lawyers gave that undertaking to the Supreme Court. But like almost everything we see in the work we do, there is a good reason, it might not be lawful, but there's a good reason why children are blindfolded, and adults. And that is, if you want to soften someone up for interrogation, a very good way of doing it is to tie them and blindfold them and basically just leave them for 5 to 10 hours before you interrogate them. And their own psychology will weaken their ability to resist, which makes it much, much easier to get a confession out of someone in that weakened psychological state when they're interrogated. And that's what we find. So that there is a good reason why the military is doing that, even though it may not be lawful. Like I said, eventually those children will be taken to one of the largest settlements, a police station in one of the largest settlements, Ariel in the north, Gush Etzion in the south, Binyamin, typically near Ramallah, for interrogation. That journey can quite frequently take 5 to 10 hours, not because these places are far away, but just it's not uncommon for the convoy to make other arrests, to stop off at military bases, And that also serves the purpose of just keeping these people tied and blindfolded. So when they are interrogated, they will be psychologically weakened. So like I said, it can be up to typically would be about 10 hours before you are interrogated. So you'll be taken into a room, your blindfold will be removed. You may have experienced some physical abuse during that period. Again, that's completely arbitrary. It will depend on the soldiers, typically in the back of the military vehicle, and their 26-year-old commander. Some of the commanders will discipline the soldiers to make sure there's no abuse. Others join in. So it's completely arbitrary whether there will be abuse. Even if there's no abuse, you will have been tied and blindfolded typically that whole time. You may or may not have been allowed to use the toilet. You may or may not have been given anything to eat or drink. You probably won't have slept at all, so you'll be sleep deprived. Again, making it easier to get a confession. You'll be taken into the room, the blindfold will be removed, and you're essentially in a small office. There'll be a desk, a computer, and an interrogator. Now, under military law, obviously you have less rights under military law than civilian law, which is why military law is supposed to be temporary. But even under Israeli military law, you still do have some rights. And key rights are you have the right to silence, and generally you have the right to consult with a lawyer prior to interrogation. The exceptions to that generally don't apply to children. What we find is, although there's been some improvement, generally in the overwhelming majority of cases, people are not informed of these rights. Sometimes the authorities sort of go through the motions. So quite often what we'll find is someone won't be informed of their rights. They'll be interrogated. It can be a fairly harsh interrogation. And then at the end of the interrogation, after the confession has been obtained, the interrogator will give the person a bit of paper informing them of their legal rights and asking them to sign that they have been informed of their legal rights after the event. And in some cases, they will also phone a lawyer so the person can speak to a lawyer after they've already provided a confession. In a smaller number of cases, the person will have a 1 minute telephone conversation with a lawyer prior to the interrogation, but that's quite uncommon.
Can I just come in there with a question, Gerard?
Oh.
We have a question from about the legality of the military courts and what they do. If Hillary is there, because Sarah, can we?
Yeah, I see it on chat.
Yeah.
Starting at the top, I mean, I think an interesting thing with the military courts is they were established on the 7th of June, 1967, 3 days into the Six-Day War. And they were established by Military Order Number 3. And what's interesting about Military Order Number 3 is it expressly references the Fourth Geneva Convention as the legal basis upon which Israel was placing the West Bank under martial law and prosecuting Palestinian civilians in military court. As of that date, that was all completely lawful. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, you can do that on a temporary basis. Then what happened after the 7th of June, 67 is a political discussion took place inside Israel as to what to do with those territories. And those that wanted to keep them and settle them dominated, and the best evidence for that is the settlements. And by September 1967, the first settlers started to move into the West Bank. And then that did cause a legal problem because whilst Israel was relying on the Fourth Geneva Convention to justify martial law and the military courts, as you would all know, that same convention prohibits settlement construction, the transfer of settlers into occupied territory. So the lawyers then were faced with, in September 67, a dilemma. And so what they did is they amended Military Order Number 3, and they simply deleted references to the Fourth Geneva Convention, carried on prosecuting Palestinians in military courts, and settling in the West Bank. And so obviously, since September 67, there has been that legal issue. What is interesting is when we do take groups to the military courts, after security, we're met by a military officer, all very friendly. He will hand out, I think they're 7-page information sheets as to putting the Israeli military's position as to why everything you see in the military courts is lawful. And what's interesting about this document is on the first page, it gives the legal rationale, and I can't fault it. it's absolutely accurate. At least it was in 1967. And in this form, the military is still relying on Article 66 of the Fourth Geneva Convention as the legal basis for prosecuting Palestinians in military courts. Obviously, you don't need to be a lawyer, though, to know that you can't pick and choose which provisions of a treaty you've signed you're going to adhere to and which ones you're going to ignore. But obviously, if anyone challenges Israel on the settlements, the official argument is the Fourth Geneva Convention does not apply to the West Bank on a de jure basis. But then the military themselves to this day are still relying on that convention to justify the military courts. You can't have it both ways. If the military courts don't apply, if the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't apply in the West Bank, then there's no legal basis for the military courts. Like I said, you're going to have less rights under martial law, which is why it's supposed to be temporary. So, I took some senior UK lawyers to the courts years ago. And I remember they looked around and they said, listen, if this was 1969, 1970, maybe 1971, this would be okay. But, 53 years later, it's obviously not okay. And, there's plenty of judicial reasoning and legal academic articles confirming that not only does the Fourth Geneva Convention apply to the West Bank, but also the human rights conventions. Now, normally in a conflict, if both human rights law and humanitarian law would apply, but because it's a conflict, the laws of war take precedence over human rights law, humanitarian law over human rights law. But what a lot of people would argue now, and I think it's a good argument, is once an occupation goes on, probably before longer than about 10 years, and it's clearly much more than an occupation, it's tied in with de facto annexation of territory, then those human rights conventions, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, should actually take precedence over humanitarian law provisions like the Fourth Geneva Convention in order to give the protected population greater rights and protections, because the occupation simply shouldn't go on that long. So then you have all the provisions in the Convention on the Rights of the Child about best interests, detention as a last resort. You shouldn't be arresting people in the middle of the night, et cetera, et cetera.
So Hilary has put an additional question that she's saying the British lawyers have made a list of the proposals to improve the situation.
Yeah, in 2011, a delegation of lawyers came out, a former Attorney General, a Court of Appeal judge, a number of QCs, and they funded by the Foreign Office, and they published a report, Children in Military Detention, and they made 40 recommendations. Since, that was in 2012, that report. 9 years later, I think 9 years later, one of those recommendations has been fully implemented. The separation, by and large, the separation of children inside detention. Generally, they are separated now. But that's a compliance rate of less than 3%. Now that delegation reformatted was due to come back in 2016.
We have another question about that.
I'll just finish this point that Keir Starmer was on that delegation. What was interesting is the original delegation back in 2011 had full access. The Israelis gave it full access. The military court judges met with them, Supreme Court judges, Israeli politicians, etc., military officers, as well as Palestinians and NGOs, etc., etc. The return visit in 2016, the flights were all booked. They were due to come in 3 days. The Israeli government informed the Foreign Office that they would get no cooperation whatsoever from Israel. And that's pretty much what we found since 2015, in that between the release of the report in 2012 and 2015, the Israeli authorities at least would go through the motions of liaising, discussing ways to improve, minimize the harm, etc., etc. They made some amendments to the military orders. And then in 2015, I think they took the strategic decision, just there's no point engaging, and they just really
Yeah.
engage.
I think Paul has got a supplementary question on this. So if you can ask it, that's great. It's basically, should Keir Starmer have insisted on coming even without the cooperation of the Israeli government?
Yeah, I mean, good question. And certainly there are arguments for and against that. I think that the thinking, I suppose, of them not coming was that if they just speak to one side, the report will just be sidelined in any event. But, I think there's strong arguments for and against that. Yeah.
I mean, what I really wanted to ask was, do you know of any current plans to pursue this any further?
No, not really. The lawyers did say in the statement that they issued in 2016 that they would put together a follow-up report, because they took the view, well, there's no point coming if they can't meet with the Israeli authorities as well, and they can put together a desk report from London by talking to NGOs and whatsoever. Unfortunately, they haven't done that. I don't know why, but they didn't put together that other report. But as it stands, this is something we based on the evidence we collect, we monitored those 40 recommendations. And so every anniversary, which is this month, we put out a statement as to how many of those recommendations have been completely fulfilled and what is the status of the others.
I also put a
Parliament about it too.
Excuse me. I also put a corollary to that about, what could we ask our MPs to do regarding this? I mean, is it a useful question to be tabled in the House?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be one. It can be that it's high time a delegation return to update the report with or without Israeli support, preferably with Israeli support. But it's the other side should not be prejudiced by the fact that the Israeli government doesn't wish to cooperate. If they don't wish to cooperate, they don't want to put their side of the story. That's the matter for them. But the other side of the story should not be prejudiced due to their decision to do that. So that's one aspect. Another aspect, I think, slightly separate, and that is that, you would have seen recently that the International Court of Justice the International Criminal Court ruled that the court has jurisdiction over Palestine. Now, I don't know, probably in the UK, but certainly here, there were a number of reports in the media that, they didn't say how many, but it seemed like a considerable number of Western democracies who are signatories to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court had probably given undertakings to the Israeli government that they would give them advanced warning of any action at the ICC, like arrest warrants, things like that. Now, that's, I think, quite a disturbing suggestion. If Western democracies continue to adhere to a position that it's a rules-based international order, why is it that they would give some accused suspects a heads up and not, do they give everyone that courtesy? Like when an African is indicted in the International Criminal Court, do they give that person advance warning of an arrest warrant? And if not, why not? So I think the question, an important question is, has the British government given the Israeli government or any Israeli citizen or officer any assurances regarding prosecutions at the International Criminal Court? And if so, what are those assurances? Because if those assurances have been given, an advance warning will be given, it completely undermines any sense of a rules-based order, which, the British government loves to tout when it comes to Russia and China. You don't have to be here very long, or you don't even have to be here at all, to appreciate, this is about interests. It's not about the rule of law. And I think my experience of getting the law enforced, at least on an international level, is interests and the law have to coincide. Take, for example, Russia. Russia is a strategic adversary. That's why 2 weeks after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the UK, the EU, America, Australia, and Canada all had targeted sanctions. That's where you had a situation of the law and interests coinciding. Very similar situation here. Israel annexes Jerusalem in 1967. Nothing happens. That's because Israel is a strategic partner. It's as simple as that. Now, from an interest perspective, I think that's completely understandable, but no one should assume that, be under any illusion that we live in a rules-based system. And that's why I think that's perhaps one angle of approach with MPs is that, you know, if you do pick and choose who you apply the law to, don't expect anyone to take you seriously when you talk about a rules-based order in Russia or China. You know, when you complain about China's actions in the South China Sea, why should anyone take that those statements of how important the rule of law is seriously when they pick and choose who they apply it to? Now, I completely understand why they pick and choose, but they will end up undermining and destroying, you know, the rules-based, the hope of a rules-based system that was established in 1945. And like I said, what we're doing is giving up our one great advantage we have over, say, communist China, our so-called values. Why would you give up your best argument, your best, you know, our best weapon in the next in the next 100 years? I don't know why you would do that.
Well, there's two questions there that I'm sure Paul could ask his local MP to ask Keir Starmer, and I think it would be very useful. I can certainly do so as well, and there are many people on this call who could, but maybe we can liaise about how to conduct this particular point. I'd like to come back to Salwa, because we have a limited time, and really wanted to know a bit more about the trauma affecting families, both after the raid and also when the when their sons come back from the jail, and particularly on the question of informers. I mean, do the informers ever get caught? People get suspected of being informers if they're let out early, or if they're treated well in prison. It's just a absolute huge amount of tensions that are caused in families. So I was hoping, Salwa, you can tell us something about this from your experiences of talking to the families.
Yes, so let's say a night raid is conducted and a child is taken away. He will probably spend 4 to 6 months in prison. Most likely he will plead guilty. He will come home and the family will organize a party. They will celebrate homecoming, invite family and friends, cook the best food, hang a banner with the boy's picture and name outside the house, thinking the nightmare had ended. But almost as soon as the party is over, at least parents tell me that they realize that the nightmare had just begun, not only for the child, but for the entire family. Mothers tell me how the sons become aggressive. They show aggressive behavior towards people around them. They become short-tempered. They isolate themselves, spend hours and hours in their bedrooms on, devices. Many of them sleep during the day and wake up at night, which is a sign of depression. They don't spend time with the family. They don't want to see anyone. They completely isolate themselves. Many of those boys, unfortunately, will drop out of school. There's a study that in the United States, it's obvious that children who spend time in prison are 13 times more likely to drop out of school than other children. And this is definitely the case for Palestinian children from my experience talking to the families. And the reason for that is spending 4 to 6 months in prison with hardly any meaningful education inside the prison makes it hard for the children to catch up. So they'd rather drop out of school rather than remain in a lower class. Everyone else moves on and either graduates or goes to a higher class, and they don't want to see as having failed. This is one issue. More importantly, the other issue is they are scared of being around boys their age, because they know one of the people around them, one of the schoolboys, probably reported them to the authorities, and that is why they ended up in prison. Interrogations are very, very harsh, and children tell me that in the end, they gave somebody's name or gave a confession simply because they couldn't take it anymore. They hadn't consulted a lawyer, they were not informed of their rights, hours and hours of repeated interrogations. And they say, okay, I'm told if I confess, I'll go home. So I'll confess, not only about me, but about my classmates. So these boys, when they're released, they're suspicious of everyone. They think the nightmare is behind them and they want to integrate and pick up their lives and move on. They find it very hard to do so. And they're very suspicious of everyone around them. More importantly, as Martin mentioned, other boys are suspicious of them because the interrogations are quite harsh, because the boys did not have any legal advice. They believe that even after they are released, that they will continue to give information about the village, about the neighbors, about the classmates, about relatives, and they completely isolate themselves. They don't engage with them at all. And these three reasons are more than enough to make the children drop out of school. And a 16, 15, 17-year-old boy without even a high school degree is a lifetime of failure, lack of opportunities, and pushing an entire society deeper and deeper into poverty. And this is exactly my experience talking to these families. The boys who end up confessing to something they believe they did not do, their understanding of the world around them is turned upside down. Because we're all told, our behavior determines whether we are, how we are treated by others. And these boys tell their parents and tell their lawyers they did not do anything wrong. And yet the lawyers and their parents advise them to plead guilty, even if they believe they are innocent, simply because it's the quickest way out of the system. And for a young person, it will, affect his or her ability to conduct normal relationships with people around him. He's very suspicious. He doesn't understand the world. Cause and effect is non-existent. Red lines have been erased. And as I said, these experiences are carried forward one generation after the other. And it has the devastating effect not only on the individual person or the family, but on the society as a whole. And in my opinion, it's deliberate. It's not coincidental. The target is not individuals. The target is the entire society, to tear the social fabric apart, to inject fear and intimidation and suspicion, to make it impossible for any person to know who's collaborating, who's giving information, and who's not. And that's exactly the point.
It's very reminiscent of what people say about Ceausescu's Romania, that 25% of the population were informers and nobody knew who they could trust. It creates a kind of sickness in society.
And to follow up, Martin, on your question, whether these collaborators or suspected collaborators are, arrested or anything. Years ago, they did. And unfortunately, some of them were, killed without trial. And many innocent people were lost that way. Unfortunately, I think these days it's so widespread, and some of these informants or collaborators provide such trivial information. Some of it is really trivial. And it's everyone that nobody even bothers to investigate them or, say a word to their parents or do something about them. It's part of life for these children and their families. It's as it, like you have furniture in the house, you have collaborators in the neighborhood. It's so widespread, and nobody does anything. And even, you know, I ask a child, you know, your neighbor, informed on you, are you upset? Do you speak to him? Do you see him? Do you play with him? And he said, sometimes I have no choice because I know he was subjected to such pressure. I don't really blame him. I forgive him. And, you know, it's this type of logic or lack of logic.
I've got a couple of supplementary questions, which I think Salwa might be able to deal with, or it might be Gerard, but let me tell you what they are. First of all, Hillary, who asked the original question, wanted to know what happens if to a child's future when they have a criminal record. And the other question has come from Anne Schofield, is about the situation in Belaine. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Salwa, but Iyad Bernat, a couple of his sons have been shot, and there has been a recent death of a young man there, and there seems to be kind of a targeting of the families of objectors. I don't know if Anne is in a position to add any more to that, but so if you're in any position to tell us about that, that would be very helpful.
I don't know, I don't have information about individual cases, but I know from my experience and working on this issue for many years that it's, I mean, at the heart of this strategy that the military adopt is collective punishment. You know, you name it, they resort to it. They want to punish the entire village if an incident happens on a road used by settlers. And they use all sorts of, you know, tactics to achieve that objective. So it is about collective punishment. There's no doubt in my mind, at least.
And does the fact that a child who's been to prison has a criminal record make life difficult for them thereafter in the West Bank?
That's a very good question. During the interrogations, the boys are told, if you don't confess, we will revoke your father's work permit. And then the father is supporting maybe 10 family members and the grandparents and the uncles, and the boy says, oh my God, I'm gonna confess so that my father's work permit is revoked. So it's used as a means to put pressure.
Okay, right. So of course I'd like to thank Salwa and Gerard very much. I'd also like to thank Mary Short, who's been organizing the recording, which will be available, and also Sarah Apps, my other half, who's been doing all the work in the background as host and organizer of this. And if there are any further questions on the chat, we will forward them, but we will also be in touch, hopefully in the next week or so, with some suggestions for which we can take further on the question of the ICC and the Children in Military Custody report, the Foreign Office report.